table, I have Kirby and Caitlin with ASMFC staff, Brandon Muffley with the council staff, Jason Snellbaker representing the Law Enforcement Committee. Moving into the agenda, the first order of business is the approval of the agenda. Is there anybody that has anything they would like to offer regarding the agenda? Adam Nowalski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So given that we found out late yesterday that the Wave 4 data was available and we will have the opportunity to discuss it today, perhaps that might warrant the item currently slated for last to be bumped up one item and finish the day with the plan review.
Okay, so that would be, we would move number 7 in front of, after number 5 before number 6. Is anybody opposed to that adjustment to the agenda? Okay, seeing none, consider the agenda modified as described by Adam. On to the approval of the proceedings. Any comment or discussion on the proceedings? Is there any opposition to the approving of the proceedings? I'm sorry, I'll get this mic right here in a second. Okay, seeing none, proceedings are approved. On to public comment. I did not receive, nobody signed up for public comment, but is there anybody in the audience that would like to make comment to the board on something that is not on the agenda? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to our next order of business, which will be the discussion and consideration of the Black Sea Bass Draft Addendum 30 for board review. Kirby is going to give that presentation, so Kirby, when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly as we have a number of items we're going to be talking about today, and we've already gone through a lot of this document with this board back in August. So I'm really trying to focus today on short background and what sections have been updated based on the board feedback in August, and then the recreational working groups feedback and recommendations. We'll talk about next steps and then get into any questions you have. So just briefly, we went through a motion in May 2017 to initiate a new addendum looking at different regional allocations, regions with uniform regulations, and other alternatives to the current north-south regional delineation. In the summer of 2017, a memo was developed with management options based on the recreational working group's feedback. That was then presented at the August meeting. The board provided feedback to staff to further develop the document. In October of 2017, the rec working group was provided an update of that document and subsequently made revisions to it. So I want to be clear that the document that was included in supplemental materials is inclusive of those revisions that were offered up by the recreational working group. And I'm just going to be making point by point what they decided to revise and change in the document in my presentation today. So, as you all are aware, the coastwide recreational catch limits for 2017 is 4.29 million pounds for black sea bass. It's a 56% or 52% increase from 2016. For 2018, though, we're looking at a recreational harvest limit that is lower than the current year's RHL. It's going to decrease by about 14%. So I've tried to highlight here, moving on to the proposed management options, the items in particular that were looked at and revised by the rec working group allocation, or the rec working group. I have a lot of working groups I'm working with these days. So the first is regarding New York's Wave 6 harvest. There was a couple of approaches that were evaluated. The new time frame that was suggested at the August meeting, and then options regarding how often allocation would be revisited. So first, I've got 4 slides regarding the smoothing approach that was discussed back in August. There was a technical committee call in September. At that technical committee meeting, there was a presentation by one of the TC members on what is referred to as a Gaussian process regression analysis. And in summary, what it does is it tries to account for the interannual changes in harvest and highlight that they shouldn't be that they should be related to each other, and that effort and potential harvest should not change by orders of magnitude from one year to the next. MRIP data for the entire time series, 1981 to 2016, was evaluated with this approach, and a new set of annual estimates, not wave-specific estimates, but annual estimates were generated from this approach. With using the new Gaussian process, the estimates then were evaluated against the MRIP estimates, and what you would see is that they are different year to year from what the MRIP estimates are. It effectively smooths through the entire time series. 2011 to 2015 MRIP estimates are lower than what the Gaussian process regression estimates are. For 2016, New York's number of fish, the MRIP estimates are about 1 million fish. The Gaussian process has it down at about 565,000 fish. So only looking at New York, this process, or this analysis, developed new estimates, recreational harvest estimates for the entire time series. It was made clear on that call that the technical committee is not certain how, if that same approach were to be applied to other states or the coast-wide estimate over the entire time series, how that smoothing approach would change and do a comparison of what the new estimates would be to the MRIP estimates. So the TC noted that if this approach were to be used, it would need to be versatile in applying both an estimate that at times might be different, might be higher than what the MRIP estimate is. So that's the idea of it needing to cut both ways. There was a concern by this board. The 2016 Wave 6 estimates were anomalously high. This approach might find that previous year's harvest that was lower would actually be higher, and then it would be a matter of if the board were to go with an approach like this to use both those estimates that are higher than the prior MRIP year estimates as well as those that are lower. There was some additional homework that was asked by the technical committee of this TC member to conduct. That hasn't been completed as of yet. The second approach that was evaluated by the group was a ratio, where we look at the prior year's harvest in wave 5 to 6 and develop a ratio of how we think that that should ultimately carry forward into subsequent years where there isn't significant changes in harvest. In summary, those years that have minimal regulatory changes were considered candidate years. And the candidate years were 2012 to 2016, 2006 to 2008, 2006 to 2008, and 2012 to 2015, and 2012 to 2015 by itself. What this approach developed were new harvest estimates just for New York's Wave 6 in 2016. But depending on which combination of candidate years are used, you might get a very different Wave 6 estimate. The technical committee found that this methodology was a little bit more intuitive and that you're just applying a ratio of prior year's harvest of these candidate years to your current year's estimate to get, a better projected harvest. But there was not a consensus reached on whether this approach or the other smoothing approach should be applied moving forward. In considering this, the REC working group recommended that without guidance at this point, that any allocation time frame in the document should be removed that includes the 2016 harvest estimates. Additionally, at the last board meeting, there was a request to include a new time frame for allocation that's using data through 2001 to 2010. In looking at it, staff determined that there wasn't post-stratified estimates for North Carolina prior to 2004. After checking in with the board member who requested this, they agreed with adjusting that requested allocation time frame to be 2004 to 2010. So instead of a 10-year time period, it would be 7 years. The REC working group pointed out that the 7-year time frame was at odds with what the other allocation time frames that were being offered up in the document, and also noted that this approach was different, or at least ran against the previous recommendation of trying to use more recent years data rather than earlier in the part of the 2000s. So there had two specific recommendations for this. The first was to remove the time frame option of 2004 to 2010, and the second was to change the allocation time frames to be 10 and 5-year blocks. Those have been adjusted and are included in the draft document that was included in supplemental materials. So if you have any questions, please reference that document that's in your supplemental materials. Next was moving on to looking at state allocation of the RHL and regional reductions. Remember, there was an option in the document to have, similar to summer flounder, state allocations of the annual RHL. The REC working group expressed concerns with keeping this option in the document, as many of them noted and expressed specific examples where they felt that state-by-state allocations would be problematic for black sea bass, not only because of some of the issues specifically encountered for summer flounder, but because the conservation equivalency approach that is used in the joint management currently is not in play for black sea bass. So having state-specific allocations when in fact they would only apply in state waters and not extend out into federal waters would also create challenges. So the working group recommended to remove state allocations of the annual RHL as an option in the document. Regarding the regional reduction options, these were sub-options in the previous document you all were given. There was too much similarities between what they were offering up and what previous ad hoc regional management options entailed. In turn, the REC working group was worried that we would be moving back, possibly if these options were selected, to the exact type of management that many have cited as problematic in recent years. So the group recommended removing options that proposed setting a regional percentage reduction, and that's reflected, as I said, in the supplemental materials draft addendum. Regarding the sub-option of revisiting allocations, it was noted at the last board meeting there was a request to include this. There were 3 options that were developed. One was a 3-year time period, one was a 5-year time period, and one was a 7-year time period. And looking at this in relation to recent addenda that the board has approved, many of them have not been extended beyond 2 years. So having an addendum that had allocation revisiting timeframes that were well beyond that did not quite match up. And so the REC working group recommended removing sub-options removing the entire sub-option of revisiting allocations and using just the expiration of the addendum as the point in which allocations could be revisited. The group also looked at the change that was included for the time frames for how long the addendum would be in play. Many of the REC working group members noted that their preference was for the document to be in play for at least more than 1 year. And as you all should be aware, we have had over the last few years the ability to extend addenda at the end of the first year. It's not an automatic carryover year in and year out. It's always an option that the board has if the addendum specifies the ability to go for more than 1 year. So the REC working group recommended removing the option of the only 1 year time frame for the addendum. So I'm just going to go through now a new management option that was proposed in the document, and then I'll be wrapping up. So the general idea that was that this option puts forward is to move away from using the MRIP harvest estimates for allocation decisions. Instead, it wants to move towards using a different metric. What was proposed and is included in the REC working group memo that's also in supplemental materials was the idea of basing that on recreational catch per angler and in turn modifying that based on the angler population. What was being considered at that point was looking at state license information as the way to modify effectively what your population is that's fishing on the resource. Additionally, catch per angler was used as an indice for tuning in the 2016 benchmark stock assessment. and as noted, this option is explained in greater detail in Appendix A of the Rec Working Group memo. So there are two regions that it puts forward that match up with what the 2016 assessment had. New York through Maine would be a northern region. New Jersey through North Carolina. North of Cape Hatteras would be a southern region. As I said, the CPA would be modified based on license information, in part because the CPA in each of those distinct regions based on the assessment are actually pretty similar. People are catching between those two regions approximately the same number of fish per trip. There would also then be one set of measures in place for each of those regions. Those example potential measures are included in the memo, and I just want to stress, as we do many times, that these are example potential measures. They are not set in stone. So if you have questions or are curious about what they are, please check out the memo. So these measures would likely be a liberalization from 2017 harvest, and the idea being that with potentially liberalizing measures, there would be the ability to further improve compliance with the state measures at the regional level, but also with that would be an ask for there to be additional recreational data collected from the fishery along 5 parameters. The first being biological sampling. The second would be trying to reduce the refusal rates for MRIP interviews. The third would be increased discard composition information. The fourth would be reducing discarding. And as I pointed out, improving compliance with management measures. And the goal would be to try to have all states move to incorporate and hit on these 5 parameters by about 2020. So this timetable that was included here was under the impression that we would maybe be having the board consider approving this document for public comment today. So I want to note that this timetable would be modified depending on how the board decides to act on this addendum today. In moving to possibly look at approving the document in December, that would adjust some of these dates that are included in the memo, so I just want to note that at this point. The last part of it is trying to move away not only from basing allocation on MRIP estimates, but also in changing how the evaluation of annual harvest and the fishery performance is year in and year out. We know that there will be tentatively an operational stock assessment scheduled for early 2019, and if this option were to be further developed and included in the document, it may include provisions that try to leave measures in place and then adjust them as needed based on the results of the 2019 operational stock assessment relative to the reference points. So the REC Working Group provided feedback on this new option. Many noted that REC CPA actually might not be appropriate for basing allocation on because the catch rates are so similar between the two regions, and licensed data is not is helpful in getting at the whole population that is fishing on the resource. It's noted that a number of states have free license registries, and that in turn, while it may create incentives for people to get the license, it also has not been effective in fully capturing the full population that's fishing on the resource. A better approach that was suggested on the call was to base allocations on the exploitable biomass, the actual population of the resource within each of these two regions. There was interest in collecting more recreational data, and that was something that many felt should be further developed and refined if this option is to be included in the document. There was also concerns raised about New Jersey's position in these two regions given their large harvest, and in recent years they haven't been grouped with southern region states that set their measures consistent with the federal waters measures. And there was a discussion, or at least a note to need further discussions on how to evaluate performance moving forward. This is something that the technical committee is continuing to work on and will hopefully be reporting out to the board at the joint meeting in December. So at this point, the REC Working Group's recommendation is to further develop this option for inclusion in the addendum. In summary, though, because it needs more work, the Rec Working Group members support delaying approval of the draft Addendum 30 until a joint meeting in December of 2017. In turn, if the board is interested in following that recommendation, no action is needed on the document today. I will note that there was a request for an additional management issue to be included in the draft Addendum 30 regarding holding permit holders, for-hire permit holders and operators responsible for violations of recreational regulations during a for-hire trip. More information on this is included in Appendix B of the memo. So with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirby, for your presentation. So Kirby's presented you kind of where we stand. The working group and the technical committee worked on the response from the previous presentation to the board from our meeting this summer. And so we've received a number of recommendations from the working group. It doesn't appear that it's the timeliness of this is mandatory that we approve this for public comment today. So there is a recommendation to delay until we meet with the council and the commission in the joint meeting in December. So there's a number of things to consider. I think while we may not need to take action, I would like to get feedback from board members as to whether or not the working group recommendations would be approved or accepted so that the document can be modified to account for those changes. But let's start with questions. If anyone has any questions about the technical nature or the presentation, now would be the time. Rob O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Kirby. And unfortunately, I could not make the last working group conference call. Looks like some further work was done. I think that's good. I would ask the part about the exploitable biomass being better than maybe the catch per angler. One of the things that Gary Shepard indicated when the stock assessment was being reviewed by the Statistical and Scientific Committee was that it's not as if there isn't abundance south of Hudson Canyon. If you remember, the assessment sort of went north and south of Hudson Canyon. There's definitely abundance there, but there's no question that the larger fish are going to be found in that northern sector. So I hope that as this goes forward with the work group, that maybe abundance is also, you know, one of the factors to look at. And the only other thing I would ask, and I don't remember how this went, but I know that with summer flounder, there was sort of a catch per angler included as an ancillary metric that John Maniscalco developed, and I don't think that that really was addressed very much at the time, but you know, this certainly would not be a precedent, but it's certainly something that can be considered later on. The third thing I would ask about was if there was uncertainty about New Jersey, and we all remember that when Tautog was undergoing the repercussions from the final assessment, it was what to do with Connecticut until the Long Island Sound situation developed, and looking at that as a region. So with New Jersey, I wasn't sure if the working group had any other recommendations that weren't placed before us today as far as, you know, that status went, whether there are any other suggestions such as New Jersey as a separate region. I'm very aware that New Jersey has said at many occasions there is a difference as you go north, so we're in that sort of same situation that we had with Tautog, and you know, we've had sort of a Delmarva approach, including North Carolina since 2011, operating under federal management measures. So the New Jersey situation is something I'd like to hear a little bit more about, if there is anything else about.
Kirby?
Sure. Thanks, Rob. So again, I think the main concern was regarding the volume of harvest that New Jersey has relative to the coast. And so the concern that was raised on the call was that setting measures for effectively the highest harvester in the region might present some challenges for the other states within a region who don't harvest nearly as much. So that was the primary concern. But I will note that currently the document still has a regional option in there where New Jersey is looked at by itself. So that is still in there as an option.
Thank you, and a quick follow-up, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Certainly.
Was there any conversation or discussion about going beyond just exploitable biomass and looking at abundance? Did that occur? I don't know.
No, there wasn't a great discussion about within the idea of unexploitable biomass, how that should be further evaluated for allocation. It was just suggested as a way to possibly parse out what allocation should be based on. So we're looking to hopefully develop that idea further over the next couple months and report back out to the board on what that could look like.
Thank you, Kirby. Nicola Meserve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kirby, I believe during the working group call, you indicated that you might be having some early discussion with GARFO about the application of F-based management that is presented here and how they might respond to it in terms of our normal management approach of working with the RHL. I asked because, I want to know if this option really has some legs, because I don't think it is ideal to delay this document. I had hoped that we could maybe get ahead one meeting in our normal timeline here in order to provide the for-hire industry and anglers earlier indication of the rules that would be operating under this year. But I can certainly support our continuing to work on this option if it has some potential and could provide some relief from managing to the RHL. Thank you.
Kirby.
Yeah, thank you, Nicola. I have not had time to reach out and further discuss this with GARFO. They are here, obviously, and it could be a question posed to them on the record, but it hasn't been further discussed with them.
Thank you, Kirby. John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Kirby. I'm sorry to be a nitpicker at this time of the day, but just wanted to repeat again that the alternative management proposal is not a liberalization for the southern region. It's only for the northern part of the range that this would be a liberalization. For us, it would be a shorter season and a lower possession limit.
Yeah, thank you, John, for that note. John's referencing what as I pointed out before, the example potential measures, but he also made this noted, and it's included in the memo as such. So, thank you.
It's too early in the day, John, to nitpick. We still have a long way to go. Any other questions for Kirby regarding his presentation? Okay, seeing no additional questions, what is the pleasure of the board regarding the further continuation or development of Addendum 30? The working group, as presented by Kirby, had a number of recommendations in moving forward. We could do so and come back to this board at the joint meeting in December for finalization of the addendum for public comment. But if the board has a different direction they'd like to take, I'd like to hear about that now. Nicola already made the point that it would have been better had we been able to take it out to public comment between now and December, but the recommendation was to continue further development of the option that just wasn't ready for prime time. That's kind of what I've heard from staff. So I'll look to the board members for any thoughts. Babalu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do support postponing until December. I do think it would behoove the board to kind of codify the key issues that we want to try to tackle between now and then, so we have a good sense of direction in terms of where we want to end up by December. Obviously, we just had a good point raised in terms of that F-based approach that relates to option 4. That seems to be key. There's the issue of the for-hire compliance piece and whether that should be included or not. So I think I would suggest postponing, but with a maybe to-do list associated with that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I will point out that and add to that, by postponing, it does not mean that the option 4, which was presented, will be able to be developed to the point where it can be considered. We may need to remove that if it's reported that it just hasn't been developed far enough. So we're not saying that it will definitely be in the document is what I'm trying to get to. And that is a good point, that we should come up with a list of what it is that we're directing staff to do between now and December. Obviously, if I don't hear any comments about deviating from the working group recommendation, I'll take that as support for the working group recommendations moving forward in modifying the current draft document. But then we also have the point that was raised late in Kirby's presentation about the for-hire fleet and whether or not we want to add an element to the document between now and the December meeting for consideration. So I'll look again to the board for discussion. Nicola Meserve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If this document is delayed, then I would be interested to task the working group, PDT, with developing that issue about for-hire noncompliance. The last working group's call came on the heels of a couple large sea bass busts that were well publicized in New York, involving the abandoned coolers and the legal language that New York lacked in order to hold those captains accountable for those violations. I'd like to see us address this if possible, if the board agrees that it's appropriate to do in draft addendum 30. I know the policy board is having a discussion on this issue tomorrow, though, and that the law enforcement committee has either talking about it yesterday or today. So their input could come into play if the working group does address it and come forward with some options for the December meeting. If it's necessary, I could make that as a motion to include that option if you want. Yes? I believe staff has a motion. That would be to move to include a second management issue in draft addendum 30 with options aimed to reduce noncompliance in the for-hire fisheries for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass, including a possible requirement for for-hire permit holders and operators to be held liable for violations of recreational fishing rules occurring during a for-hire trip.
Okay, Nicola, thank you for your motion. I'll look to the board for a second. Second by David Borden. Discussion on the motion. Nicola, would you like to add anything in addition to your comments already stated?
Yes, I guess I would point out that there is a federal rule that provides some language about commingled catch and the captain of that vessel being accountable for violations of the possession limit. So that is some additional language that the working group could review. I believe there are a couple states that have rules other than just Massachusetts. And the council had some discussion of this last week, and there was a suggestion about a requirement for the labeling of coolers. So there's really a couple different issues, options that the working group could look to move this motion with. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. David, did you have anything to add as a seconder?
Nicola just made the point, but the only thing I'd add is this basically requires us to develop something we're going to look at later and then make a final decision on whether or not it goes into a public hearing document. I think it's appropriate strategy.
Thank you, David. And I'll just add to Nicola's comment regarding the council discussion last week. So this was brought up at the Mid-Atlantic Council meeting, and the Mid-Atlantic Council has on its priority list for 2018 a recreational black sea bass amendment that they plan to initiate. There is little definition to what that amendment might be, but it could very well include provisions regarding what's being discussed here regarding the for-hire fleet and accountability. So, as Nicola mentioned, there are a number of different roads converging on one issue, and I could see it as a reasonable exercise to go through the process of putting together some alternatives and some options on the issue for your consideration for public comment at the December meeting. Any other comments? Chris Batsavage?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, for development purposes, I could support this. I think this issue can potentially go beyond summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. And we've had some internal discussions with our law enforcement staff as far as what we're able to enforce dockside with the for-hire fleet compared to the charter boat fleet. I'm very interested to hear the discussion tomorrow at the policy board and any report back from the law enforcement committee regarding this. And I think that, along with the things discussed last week, may help us determine whether or not this addendum is the right avenue to address this issue. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Babalu?
Thank you. And just picking up on Chris's comment, I mean, right now this is a draft, of course, but it is titled Draft Amendment 30, Black Wreck Sea Bass Management for 2018. So this would expand the scope to include, the non-compliance issue as it pertains to not just black sea bass, but summer flounder and scup as well. That may well fit, but I guess we just have to make sure we revise the frame, if you will, for this addendum. And as long as staff feel comfortable that it's an appropriate fit, I'm fine with this motion. It just seems that we're now broadening beyond black sea bass, and I just want to make sure that's on the record. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Bob. Kirby, do you see any problem with expanding the scope for this one particular issue to the other species in the FMP?
I do not. I think that's fine.
Any other discussion? Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you want to have a motion to include the rest of the committee's recommendations? Do you need that? And if so, you don't. Okay.
No, after we take up this motion, I will look for any opposition to the committee's recommendations, and if we have some, we may need a motion. But if there's no opposition, staff will move forward as directed by the committee and this board. Any other discussion on the motion? Anyone from the audience like to provide any comment to the motion? Paul? It's down on the end next to Andy. You can sit with him for a little while and keep him company.
I'm Paul Forsberg, Viking Fishing Fleet, Montauk, New York. I don't think there's anybody in this room that can tell me how you can have 100% compliance on the fisheries when you have 100+ people on one boat at one time, when you can catch your limit of fish within 3 to 4 hours. And I don't know how anybody in this room could tell me how to do it. I've been running a boat for 60 years now this year, and I haven't figured out a way to do it. We have our regulations printed on the back of our fare tickets. We announce it every time we stop the boat, what the regulations are. We have measurements on the rail. We have signs throughout the boat. We have the regulations on our webpage. And we have a lot of people that don't speak English. And that's where it's at. Okay, we can put our fare tickets on different language other than the English language. Well, we have Chinese. We have Portuguese. We have Spanish, and I don't know what, I can't get a ticket big enough to put all the languages on it that people understand. And I don't know how the boat can be held responsible for multi-passenger vessels with 100 or so people in that amount of people on the boat. We're common carriers. We shouldn't be blamed and held responsible any more than a bus driver is held responsible for somebody carrying drugs on the bus, or a train operator running a train and somebody's got drugs on the train. A small 6-pack passenger boat, yes, they can count their fish, they can control them. You have 2 mates over 6 passengers maximum. But when you get up into multi-passenger boats, there is no way that you can keep track of it. We do our best. I talked to Tony Delenio about this problem a couple of weeks ago at the other meeting in Riverhead, and are willing to sit down, industry, feds, state, let the 3 of us sit down and see if we can make some kind of regulations that'll be better than what we have now that we can comply with. But there's no sense in putting on a regulation you have on the board here now where it's impossible to comply with. And if you want to put all the party boats out of business, you're doing a pretty good job right now by closing us down for a month. It is past month, just ask anybody in the business. But that will most certainly put us out of business. If that's your intention, fine. I'm going to be laying people off now to this 30-day closure we had for sea bass this past October. I'm going to lay off people that I haven't laid off in 22 years. I employ 52 people in Montauk. I'm going to be laying people off now because of that closed season, how that knocked us dead. And that's where we're standing. So instead of putting a law like this through, folks, let's get together and maybe we can make something that'll make everybody happy and we can compromise on something that we can all work with and something that'll work. That's not going to work. You just signed the death warrant of every multi-passenger boat there is. Thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you, Mr. Forsberg. Any other comments from the audience before I come back to the board? Okay, seeing none. I think for clarification, I'd like to ask the question of the maker of the motion regarding, it states here that the alternative would include a possible requirement for permit holder operators to be held liable. Would you, as part of this motion, Nicola, would you be suggesting that there may be an alternative to hold the fishermen liable or accountable based on the marking of coolers or any other type of, procedure that would be a decision point in the addendum for not just holding charter boat captains and operators liable, but for anglers' liability as well?
Yes, exactly. I foresaw the working group suggesting some other options that would achieve the main part of the motion, which would be to improve non-compliance. And that was just one example of an option.
Okay, thank you. That's clear. David Bush.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm obviously very sensitive to the folks that are out there on the water. As you all know me by now, I would be interested in seeing other options, at least having some to choose from with possibly some public comment on how that would impact that particular sector. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Rachel Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd have to also echo that I'm pretty uncomfortable with this, and that may come from a couple years of working on a for-hire headboat where you have people fishing on both sides of the boat and you trying to scatter from one side to the other, and just knowing that a fish is slipped into a cooler and knowing that my livelihood would be dependent on me being able to catch that individual if I had my permit on the line. It makes me uncomfortable, and I would welcome any law enforcement onto the boat, and I would certainly let them know which cooler went with who or who I knew, but to take on that responsibility just kind of makes me uncomfortable. So I understand we're not making this decision right now, but I could see that our for-hire sector would be a little bit uncomfortable with taking on that responsibility. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. I have Adam Nowalski, and then Roy, I'll come back to you. Adam?
Thank you very much. So addendum 33, it just looks weird, triple X up there. Well, 30, we'll just call it 30. Maybe we should label 30 instead of putting 3 X's up there moving forward. But we're already talking about working on developing options. It's already a complicated issue. This item in and of itself could take up an entire addendum unto itself, I'm quite sure. There's certainly concerns raised. I haven't heard the law enforcement report I'm looking forward to. But at this point in time, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to make a motion to substitute. And that motion is move to task our existing working group with developing options aimed to reduce non-compliance in the summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass for-hire fisheries.
Okay, thank you for that motion, Adam. We're going to wait until we can get it on the board, and then I'll look for a second. So let me just ask the question. So your motion does not add this as an element now to the addendum. It tasks the working group to talk through it and bring it back for board consideration at a later date.
That is correct.
How does that read, Adam, as you intended?
I believe it's exactly as I stated it. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll look for a second. Emerson Hasbrook seconds the motion. Discussion on the motion? Again, let me just clarify that this would task the working group rather than add this as an element to Addendum 30, as the previous motion stated. Babalu?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't support the motion because I feel that the main motion accomplishes the same thing. The working group is going to need to continue to work on developing options for potential incorporation into the addendum. We can cross the bridge when we come to it in terms of whether we feel we're ready for prime time, whether we're ready to adopt one of the options. If so, fine. If not, we kick it back for further work. So I do not support the substitute. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Roy Miller, I know that you had your hand up earlier, but do you want to speak to one of these?
Yeah, I'll switch to the new topic here, if that's all right, Mr. Chairman. I think I support the substitute motion. I was very uncomfortable with the original motion based on the remarks by Rachel and Captain Forsberg. And I think this is heading in the right direction, so I would support the substitute motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. Any other comments by the members of the board? Okay, does everyone need a minute to caucus? I could use 30 seconds with my delegation. Okay, we'll caucus for 30 seconds. Thanks. Okay, I'm going to read the motion, and then we're going to take a vote. Move to substitute to task our existing working group with developing options aimed at reducing noncompliance in the summer flounder, scup, black sea bass for hire fisheries. Is the board ready to call the question? All those in favor of the substitute, please indicate by raising your hand. That's 8 in favor. All those opposed, same sign. 2 opposed. Any abstentions? 1 abstention. Any null votes? 1 null vote. Motion carries. So the substitute motion now becomes the main motion. Do we need any additional time for caucusing on the main motion? I'm not seeing anybody shaking their head up and down, so I'm going to call the question again. The substitute becomes the main motion. All those in favor of the main motion, please indicate by raising your hand. I'm sorry, hold on 1 second. I'm being asked to slow down.
Just trying to get it up on the screen real quick, sorry.
Okay, the motion is move to task our existing working group with developing options aimed at reducing noncompliance in the summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass for higher fisheries. All those in favor of the motion, please indicate by raising your hand. It's 12 in support. All those opposed, same sign. That's 0. Any abstentions? Any null votes? All right, seeing neither, motion carries. Tony?
Is the intent of the timing to include this in Addendum 30? Or no, just what's the time frame that you want this, the report then?
I think it'll depend, given the interest of not having this included in Addendum 30, which the previous original motion would have done. To me, I think the priority now would be to work on the provisions of the addendum as they stand, and when the working group has time to discuss the options for reducing noncompliance, then we'll take that up. But my first priority would be to make sure that the Addendum 30, as it has the elements in it, are developed as fully as possible before we consider it again in December. Adam?
And I'll confirm that that is in fact the intention of the motion to substitute, which became the main motion, to definitely not include it in Addendum 30, but for it to become the next task for the working group to address, and whether that was then developed into the next addendum or whether they had some other means for moving forward to it, that would be the purpose of their task.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, I'm going to ask one last time, is anyone opposed to staff moving forward as it was recommended and presented today regarding the working group recommendations on Addendum 30? The idea being that any options that need further development will be further developed, and any alternatives that were removed or modified would be done by staff for a final report at the December joint meeting with the council for final action as to moving it forward to public comment. Rob O'Reilly.
So just a question on, the working group didn't really feel strongly on the catch per angler and was looking for other methods, and the biomass was brought up as one to look at allocation. Is the working group going to look at other approaches? So if that needs to be stated, I think my understanding, again, from the stock assessment results, were that there is abundance both south and north of the Hudson Canyon, but it's going to be the biomass that is more pronounced north of Hudson Canyon. So could the abundance stream be looked at as well? It should be available, and I just wonder if that needs to be specified today.
Kirby?
We don't need a motion for it, but it would just be great to know specifically what you want explored in this option. So we can talk offline if that's best, but the more clarity we can get, the better.
Rob?
That'd be fine, and I will look forward to not having a conflict for the next working group.
Okay, thanks, Rob. All right, seeing no one opposed, we're going to move forward as I just stated. And Rob, you can work with staff on further developing the portion of that option that you mentioned about abundance. Okay, we're going to move on to our next agenda item, which is to review the preliminary 2017 recreational harvest estimates through Wave 4. This was something that we put on the agenda not knowing if we would have preliminary harvest estimates through Wave 4, but we're lucky enough to have received them yesterday. So staff worked feverishly throughout the night to make a presentation here for you today. Kirby?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to walk the group through, as we have done in previous years, what the harvest looks like through Wave 4 relative to the previous year. Because we now have Caitlin up here with me, I'm going to deal with the summer flounder and scup harvest estimates, and then I'm going to turn it over to her. So there's a little typo right now on the outline. But I just want to stress what Mike pointed out, which is these are preliminary estimates, and they're ones that we received yesterday. So the technical committee has not had time to sit down, digest them, or do further analysis to see if there's any outliers, if there's any issues, what the PSCs are, which we also know, just to note, do change from wave to wave as that information is updated throughout the year. So just keep all that in mind as we go through this presentation. So regarding the coastwide harvest and weight, in 2017, preliminary harvest estimates through wave 4 indicate coastwide harvest was 2.8 million pounds, which is below our RHL for 2017 of 3.77. It's approximately 75% of the RHL. Now again, in weight, what this also means is that relative to the coastwide harvest at this point through wave 4 last year, we have a reduction in harvest by about 49%. And as you all are aware, we have measures that were implemented in 2017 that differed from those in 2016. But overall, the coastwide harvest through wave 4 is significantly different than what it was last year. I also have a slide up here, and it's a little bit more difficult to see with the harvest breakdown by state. I want to point out that as we had measures implemented per Addendum 28 that were fairly uniform across the coast in terms of an increase in the size limit and a decrease in the possession limit for most states, the performance so far in the year is very variable. It's not uniform by region. As you'll see, highlighted in red on the screen are some states that actually increased their harvest relative to last year. But because those states that increased their harvest contribute so insignificantly to the overall coastwide harvest, it's kind of a wash, and so we have an overall reduction at the coastwide level. In terms of number of fish and doing that comparison of harvest from wave 4 to between 2016 and 2017, it's a similar trend. Again, about 75% of the RHL. When we're looking at the RHL and numbers of fish, we're using the average fish weight through the data we have. Through wave 4, it's about 3.12 pounds is the average fish weight. And in terms of what that reduction looks like relative to this time last year, it's closer to a 50% reduction. And again, this is what the breakdown looks like when looking at the numbers of fish by state in harvest. Now, in terms of our summer flounder recreational specifications, as I mentioned, we have a 3.77 million pound RHL this year. That's the coastwide recreational harvest limit, which is approximately 1.2 million fish. In 2018, the recreational harvest limit is 4.42 million pounds. So in terms of the percentage change, just looking at the catch limit on the coastwide level between 2017 and 2018, it's about a 17% increase. I'll also note that we didn't have time to do projections. We normally work with council staff to try to pull that together, and we just frankly didn't have enough time to do that today. I will point out that what we do know is that many states have their fishery that are significant harvesters closed through the end of the year. So there's a good chance that the numbers won't change significantly from what they are currently, but we still need to do that analysis, and we'll be reporting that out in December. Next, I'll move on to Scup. This is just a very brief breakdown of what the harvest is in numbers of fish and in pounds relative to the RHL. Similar to last year, in terms of how we've performed relative to the RHL, we're just at about 50% of the RHL. In terms of the overall harvest, though, we have decreased from last year. So in numbers of fish, it's about a 1% decrease. In terms of looking at harvest and weight, it's actually about a 21% reduction in harvest. So with that, I'll turn it over to Caitlin to go through black sea bass.
Thanks, Kirby. All right, so looking at the comparison from 2016 to 17 for the coastwide harvest, it's looking like at the coastwide level, there's about a 23% reduction in harvest through wave 4. And as you can see, the northern region shows a 25% decrease, and the southern region, excluding North Carolina, because at this point we don't have post-ratified numbers, is increasing 31%. But I do want to note that the southern region is harvesting an order of magnitude less than the northern region. So don't focus too much on the percentage. Focus more on the coast-wide harvest being smaller this year. So that puts us this year at 60% of the RHL, whereas last year at this time it was around 119%. And in numbers of fish, we still have the same reduction, but smaller, using the average fish weight of about 2 pounds in 2016. That's pretty much it.
Thanks, Caitlin. So moving on, just again a reminder of where we stand regarding our RHL this year to next year. When looking at the 2017 RHL, we're at 4.29. As I mentioned in our last presentation, it's a big increase from where we were in 2016. And then we're looking at a reduction just at the coast-wide catch limit for 2018 relative to 2017. So in terms of rec management options for 2018, I want to remind the board that we went through this for a number of these species back in August. And so today, there is not the need for any specific motion. We have a number of options for these species. For summer flounder, there is the FMP status quo or state-by-state conservation equivalency. Additionally, as an option, there's the ability to extend the current provisions of Addendum 28 for an additional year. Black sea bass, there's the FMP status quo, which would specify a coast-wide set of measures in both state and federal waters. As noted in my earlier presentation, staff is working with the REC working group on developing draft Addendum 30. That will be presented at the December meeting. And then Scup, we have the ability for the board to carry over status quo regional management measures for 2018. So again, next steps, no action needed today, and the board and council will be setting 2018 recreational specifications in December. So I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirby. No action is needed, and I'm going to keep questions limited at this point, given the interest of time and other issues on the agenda. So we will take a question or two if anyone has any questions regarding the new numbers. Yeah, John Clark.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just quickly, I don't have the figures in front of me. Do the catches of black sea bass by wave, do we typically see a lot of variation? I mean, is this looking like by the end of the year we'll still be under the RHL, or do we sometimes see a lot of variation with big catches in waves 5 and 6?
There typically has been a lot of variation in waves 5 and 6, and we do have 2 states that typically harvest a large amount in those waves, so I'd say it's not really sure how we'll fare by the end of the year.
Thanks, Caitlin. Rob O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So where are we standing with the projection from 2017 through wave 4, and knowing that the RHL is going to decline for 2018, whereabouts is it figured that we might be once all is said and done through wave 6? Is that available to talk about?
That was a perfect segue, Rob, to the next item on the agenda, which Brandon is going to discuss what he's been able to put forward as a projection so that we can evaluate for what we know now, where we may end up being compared to next year's RHL to help us decide on the black sea bass wave 1 fishery. So if you can hold your thoughts there, Rob. And again, Brandon is only going to we're only talking, the next agenda item is the black sea bass. It's not for all other species, but we'll be there shortly. Any other questions for Kirby or Caitlin? Okay. Seeing none, let's go ahead and move on to the next item on the agenda. As it was modified at the beginning of this meeting, we're going to skip over the FMP review and state compliance right now. And we're going to consider the potential February 2018 opening of the black sea bass recreational fishery. Just to give you a very, very simple background on why we're discussing this again, I've had the question asked of me as to, I thought we handled this, I thought this was done. Well, back when we met jointly with the council at our meeting in Philadelphia in August, the council, the question was asked and it was voted down at the council. And given the fact that both the board and the council need to move in lockstep on issues like this, there was no need to take that issue up with the commission or with the board. Because we were running short on time that evening, some members of the board felt that it needed a little more time to thoroughly discuss and debate and to decide whether or not there would be an opening. So it was asked of me as Mid-Atlantic Council Chair and your board chair here today to put this back on the agenda. It was put back on the agenda at the council meeting last week, and the council supported what you're going to see after Brandon's presentation, which is a motion that will need to be taken up and considered by the board today. I will state that once the motion is brought forward to you, there can be no modifications to the motion. I'm going to look to the board for somebody to make that motion and second the motion. But unlike a typical motion, because again, the board and the council need to move in lockstep with one another on these issues, it cannot be modified. If it is to be modified, we'll have to take it back to the council, and that will further delay any action, which will make it impossible for February opening. So with all of that said, Brandon is ready to go, and I want to turn to Brandon for his presentation. Brandon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to present the same information that I gave to the council last week with a few changes to the end. So last week I presented some projections and some information through Wave 3 and what those implications may mean for the rest of the fishery and as you consider Wave 1. Since we do have the Wave 4 estimates, I updated everything. I created some new projections to evaluate what the harvest may look like through the rest of 2017. But again, noting that I have not done a thorough evaluation of looking at PSEs and variability within some of those estimates. It's kind of taking the raw information, running some projections to see what we may be looking at for the rest of the year. So I just will sort of highlight that, and I will when I get to those slides later on. So the council and board have talked a lot this year about Wave 1. I think almost every meeting so far this year we've talked about implementing a Wave 1 fishery in 2018. And just a quick refresher of where we are, it sort of started in February when we got the new benchmark stock assessment information indicating stock was robust and fishing mortality was low. So there was consideration then to move forward with an exempted fishing permit for 2018. When the board and council met jointly in May, you all decided not to move forward with an EFP, but consider development of a letter of authorization program. So that started in May, but after discussing after that meeting, there was going to be no way to get a letter of authorization program in place for 2018. So if there was still interest in having a Wave 1 fishery, you needed to do it through the specification setting process. So that was discussed at the June meeting. So you all met in August and considered the Wave 1 fishery for 2018 through the specification process, and there were a few different options that were voted on, and none of them were approved. But since then, as the chairman indicated, there has been some more discussion since then and reconsideration, and specifically what was discussed as what we would consider would be a February season. So a season from February 1st to the 28th, a 15-fish possession limit and a 12.5-inch minimum size. So the analysis that I did on the next slide looked at considering this specific Wave 1 fishery for 2018. And I will state that we will be talking about a Wave 1 fishery again when we meet in December. That'll be the first framework meeting for the letter of authorization program. So we'll have information then in terms of what that may begin to look like for a 2019 Wave 1 fishery. So the Wave 1 discussions won't end after today. So this was information that you've seen. This was part of my information when we talked in May, and a similar analysis was done when we talked in August. I needed to try to come up with what harvest may look like in 2018 if we were to have a Wave 1 fishery. So the only information that I had available to me was federally permitted for hire vessel VTR information. So I took that information that we had, I looked at it from all of the data that we had, but I really relied on the 2013 VTR data. That was the last time we had a Wave 1 fishery. So I'm applying what we saw in 2013 and using that information to project what harvest might look like 5 years later in 2018. So just sort of keep those sort of caveats in the back of your mind. So I looked at a few different participation scenarios, not knowing what participation may do. It had been increasing over time. The number of vessels participating in the Wave 1 fishery from 1996 through 2013 had steadily increased. But again, I evaluated a potential decline in participation all the way to continuing increasing participation. The scenario number 3 that's highlighted in green, that is what the information was in 2013. So in 2013, we had 39 for-hire vessels participate in the Wave 1 fishery. Each vessel took an average of 6 trips during that wave. They carried 26 anglers on each trip. Their average harvest per angler was 11.1 sea bass. And so I used that information to come up with what the total harvest would be by the for-hire sector during Wave 1. And that came out to be 137,000 pounds. So that was just the for-hire sector during a potential Wave 1 fishery. So I needed to try to expand that. If we were going to open up the Wave 1 fishery, the private anglers would also be available to participate. But I didn't have any information to sort of scale that fishery. So I looked at the catch in Wave 6 to evaluate that. And that information had indicated during Wave 6, I looked at the average catch from 2013 to 2015, and that showed that 50% of the black sea bass catch in Wave 6 was from the private sector and 43% was from the for-hire sector. And so what I had done back in August, I had dropped that a little bit and assumed that private angler participation would likely continue to decline in Wave 1, given weather and the time of the year and where the fish are available further offshore, and I said it was 50-50. So that's what I used to scale that information. I did receive some additional input after that meeting to evaluate Wave 2, that Wave 2 might be more reflective of what Wave 1 might be. So I did look at that as well. Black sea bass hasn't been open a whole lot in Wave 2 the last number of years, so I had to go back and I looked at from 2002 to 2012, I looked at the catch during that time period and found that 42% of the harvest in Wave 2 was for the private sector and 58% was for the for-hire sector. So the 50-50 ratio that I ended up using is kind of right in the middle of what we found in Wave 6 versus what we found in Wave 2. So I felt that that was still an appropriate approximation to scale what the private mode harvest might be in Wave 1. So if you take that, you would get a total harvest in Wave 1, assuming, again, the same for-hire participation, that would give you a harvest of 275,000 pounds. That was if the entire Wave 1 fishery was going to be open. So then I used the proportion of harvest in Wave 1 in February and the average February harvest per day to come up with what the harvest might be just on a February 1st to February 28th season. And under a similar participation rate that we saw in 2013, I estimated that harvest during Wave 1 would be about 101,000 pounds. So that's kind of where we were. Again, I just want to highlight that I'm applying 2013 data and what things might look like in 2018. I think availability is likely different now than what it was in 2013, and what participation might look like. Again, I tried to provide a range of what participation may be, but that's going to be sort of unknown in terms of how high of an interest there may be during that time period. There's a lot of numbers up here, but again, it's tables that you all have seen. So any harvest that takes place in Wave 1 needs to be accounted for, and therefore modifications to the rest of the recreational season would need to be made to account for that. So if In the memo that was provided in the supplemental materials, this is Table 2 on page 4 of the memo. So again, I looked at reductions that would need to be taken at a coast-wide, at the federal or the southern region level, or at a state-specific level. And generally, you're looking at anywhere under any of these different scenarios, a minimum of 1 day would need to come off to a maximum of about 4 to 5 days on some of the higher harvest estimates. So you're looking at anywhere from 2% to 4% of the 2018 RHL would be allocated to this Wave 1 fishery in 2018 under a February-only season. So that's generally what you're looking at in terms of implications, what harvest might look like. So this is the projections and estimates through Wave 4. I did provide a breakdown here looking at comparing 2016 to 2017 by state so that you can see where some of the changes have been. Again, through Wave 4, we're, just as Caitlin had mentioned, we're 15% lower in terms of numbers of fish and 23% lower in total weight. This does not include North Carolina, no slight to North Carolina, but I didn't have the SAS code to post-stratify that information. And North Carolina, in terms of their black sea bass landings north of Hatteras, is only, the last few years, is like 1,500 pounds. So it's not a major player in terms of what we're looking at. So we wouldn't modify what we're looking at here. I did run some projections looking at the average proportion of Wave 3 and Wave 4 harvest from 2014 to 2016, assuming that we're going to have that those two waves would make up a similar proportion of harvest in 2017, which is about 65% of the overall harvest occurs in those two waves over the last 3 years. So assuming that, I came up with a projection for 2017 of 3.97 million pounds. Again, as there was a question about sort of the variability within Wave 5 and 6, as Caitlin pointed out, the last few years those estimates have been highly uncertain. We have probably the most uncertain estimate ever during that time period last year. And there are states, significant states, that are open in Wave 5 and 6. So again, these are very preliminary. In terms of just its evaluation, and 5 and 6, we still have about 35% of the harvest to still be accounted for in Wave 5 and 6. So just under those caveats, that's what I came up with as a projection for harvest for the rest of the year. If that were to play out, that would put us at 7.5% below the 2017 RHL. And when we compare it to the 2018 RHL, we're about 8% over that. So just to wrap everything up, when you are considering this, again, I kind of talked about all of those harvest analysis caveats that I kind of mentioned in using the VTR data, how I scale the VTR data to the private sector, what effort and participation is going to be, are all sort of uncertain at this point in time. But generally, using those sort of caveats, it looks like a Wave 1 fishery would account for anywhere from 2 to 4% of the 2018 RHL. I just showed you the preliminary 2017 harvest estimates and the projections. Again, any harvest that is allocated to Wave 1 needs to be accounted for and would be on top of any reductions, if there are any reductions necessary through the rest of the fishery. And it's been pointed out on a number of occasions that there is no data collection program in place during that time. It's self-reported VTR data is the only information that we have, so collecting additional catch and effort information during this Wave 1 fishery would be really important in terms of evaluating how successful and what the implications of this Wave 1 fishery may be. And lastly, I just put up there, this is the motion. I think it'll come up under different screens so that we can modify it or so that the board can also consider it. But this is the motion that was approved last week by the council. It goes beyond just implementing specific measures for the Wave 1 fishery. It also talks about how much would actually be allocated to that Wave 1 fishery. And it also does indicate that any adjustments that are needed to the rest of the recreational season would only be applied to those states that actually participate in the Wave 1 fishery. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you for your presentation, Brandon. And since the, well, let's do this. Let's take a couple questions on specifics regarding the analysis. If we get too far into the weeds as to something that may be different from what the motion is, I'm going to cut off the question asking, and we'll put the motion on the screen, and then we can speak to the motion. But I saw John Clark first. John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess actually I was just curious about the motion, and particularly, do you want to wait on any questions about the motion and how it would affect regulations?
Yes, let's
Okay.
if anyone has any questions about how Brandon got to his projection, which I guess, Rob, that was to your question before. I will say that at last week's council meeting, the council received a projection that was much different from what the projection is now. It was a much higher reduction that was going to be needed based on Wave 3 estimates. Now that Wave 4 are available, it has changed that. So you are receiving slightly different information from what the council received, but it's all in the same line of information. It's just some of the numbers have been modified. But let's hold questions for just specifics regarding the analysis. Anything regarding the motion, we'll take up those questions once the motion is made by the board. Any questions? Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Brandon, for your presentation. The question I have is, you had mentioned that 2013 was the last year that there was a Wave 1 fishery, and you used that as a basis to project these estimates forward into 2018. So, what was the source of that catch data in 2013? Was that also self-reported VTR data, or were there intercepts that were conducted during Wave 1? And then I have a possible follow-up depending on the answer. Thank you.
Brandon?
That's strictly for hire, self-reported for hire VTR data. That was the only information that I had available.
So then, do we have any idea how realistic those reported catch numbers are?
No, I mean, that's was part of the sort of discussion when we were talking about an exempted fishing permit and could be part of the LOA program is sort of validating some of that information that's being reported on the VTRs, because we just don't have any verification of that VTR information that's coming across. It's just, it is what it is, just as it is on the commercial side, on some things where we don't have observers on board. So it's all self-reported, no validation.
Thanks, Brandon. Any other questions regarding specifics? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to ask that we bring the motion, put the motion up on the screen. Okay, so as I mentioned before, this is the exact motion that was made and supported at last week's Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Council meeting. I'll now look to the board for any board member that would like to make the same motion. Adam Nowalski.
Would you like the motion read?
Please.
Move to recommend National Marine Fisheries Service open the black sea bass recreational fishery in federal waters from February 1st, 2018 through February 28th, 2018, with a minimum size limit of 12.5 inches and a per-person daily possession limit of 15 fish. Based on staff analysis, the 2018 recreational harvest limit that applies to the remainder of the fishing year will be reduced by the preliminary estimate of 100,000 pounds to account for expected catch during the February season. Adjustments to the 2018 recreational measures to account for this estimated February catch will be required only of states that participate in the February fishery. And if I get a second, Mr. Chairman, and have the opportunity to speak to the motion, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a motion made by Mr. Nowalski. Do I have a second on the motion? Seconded by Rob O'Reilly. Adam?
Thank you very much. So let me first begin by again thanking board leadership and council leadership, staff for the effort that's gone into this. As was mentioned, we did run up against quite a bit of time constraint in Philadelphia, and we certainly had the opportunity to flesh this out a bit more, for which I'm extremely gracious. In speaking to a number of council members and board members since that August meeting, a number of issues, some of which have been already discussed here today, one of which has been the need for monitoring during that time period. New Jersey has 3 large vessels, approximately 100 foot in length, that have the ability to prosecute this fishery. Our state's Bureau of Marine Fisheries has been willing to dedicate 2 technicians during the month of February to run trips with those vessels to help validate catch data on board the vessels. We're also able to implement a for-hire logbook survey in this fishery. It's currently in place for our striped bass fishery, and we can extend it to our other for-hire fisheries that may participate. We're also able to do rat collection during the time frame to get some more biological information. We expect all of this information would help address the concerns that people around the table have regarding the need for better science during this time period. We also think that these steps that we put in place will certainly be a large step towards informing the letter of authorization framework process that will be taken up jointly with the council beginning in December. These are all pieces of information that we need. I think this last element of the motion here, this was brought up by John Bullard in Philadelphia, was worked on quite a bit with the help of the service. I'm extremely grateful for their time in working on it with us, and I think it speaks for itself. Will be required only of states that participate in the February fishery. So essentially, those states that choose not to would be held harmless the rest of the year. There have been questions about how exactly that would play out timeline-wise. My expectation would be in the coming months we'd be going through our spec setting process. We've essentially started it here today with the ongoing discussions with the addendum in more detail in December, and we'll go through February as we complete that addendum. I know staff has worked up individual numbers for individual states that might be participating in the fishery, and so those states that declare an interest as we go through the Addendum 30 process, this number would be accounted for moving forward there. And lastly, I'll simply offer again the magnitude of what this fishery is. We're talking about 100,000 pounds potentially out of a fishery with a near 50 million pound spawning stock biomass. We've got the opportunity to provide some fishing days, provide public access for something that's sorely needed. We heard comments earlier at the outset of the meeting about what closures have done to the industry. We've got an opportunity to get science. We've got an opportunity to inform the LOA process we've already agreed to embark on, and we're holding harmless those states that choose not to participate. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam. Rob O'Reilly as seconder. Would you like to add to Adam's comments?
Yeah, well, Adam's covered a lot of what Virginia thinks about this as well. Of course, we would have a public hearing. If this motion passes, we still would have to go through that process. We do have the capability to do sampling. We do have a freezer collection program. Adam mentioned the racks. Not to go into a lot of details, but there would be several items that would have to go forward in order for someone to participate, including a hail-in, so that if law enforcement wanted to be available, they could, but mainly so that the biological collections also could take place. Virginia's been interested in a Wave 1 fishery since December of 2013. I think most of you understand that by 2015, the climate changed quite drastically. One of the main concerns at the Mid-Atlantic Council was the data collection. I agree with Adam that this will be a setup for the LOA program in that whatever data can be collected will be advantageous for 2019. The other part of reticence that at least I sensed was that, you know, now we're talking about perhaps an 8% overage, which was greater at the council meeting. I agree with that. And some will think, well, what does that mean as we go later into the waves? But please know, as Caitlin mentioned earlier, the Delmarva situation is not only an order of magnitude less in terms of the ability to harvest, but it's a little more than that, quite frankly. It's been that way really since 2010, and I thank you for the time.
Thank you, Rob. Questions, comments on the motion? John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I like the fact that the adjustments to the 28 recreational measures will be required only as states participate, but it's just more of a question of how this whole thing would work. I mean, when we discussed this with anglers and headboat captains in Delaware, they were very concerned about Brandon's projections here showing that if his scenario 3 took place, that we'd lose 4 days in, 4 days in wave 3 or 3 days in wave 5. They weren't willing to trade those days and those waves for possibility of fishing in February. And I understand what this motion would require only those states to do this if there was cutbacks required. But how would that work with states like Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia that set the regulations based on the federal rules and have to abide by whatever the federal rules are and do pretty much all their black sea bass fishing in federal waters? Do we have a guarantee that federal rules would not change, but only the states that go over this? I just don't understand how this whole thing would work, and is there any way to clarify that?
There's no guarantees in life, John. Somebody must have said that to you many, many, many years ago.
I know there's no guarantees. I just meant that, obviously, to get to this point, I'm assuming that NIMFS has looked at this, and how would they enforce the overages on the states that actually participate in this without affecting the regulations out in the federal waters that Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia would have to abide by?
So I'm going to offer my thoughts, and then I might look down the table to Lindsay to add. And so we've been having these conversations, and you bring up an excellent point, John, about how it will work. We have the potential for states that want to participate in this fishery to be held accountable to some degree to the 100,000 pounds being offered in the motion. We also have Addendum 30 that is currently in progress, and it may assign regions to specific states in moving forward for 2018. So those are two things that somewhat complicate the issue, and I'd like to be able to tell you exactly how this will work. The way I foresee it taking place is that if a state agrees to participate or wants to participate, there would have to be a decision by the board at some later time as to how that 100,000 pounds is accounted for by those states that participate. Is it equal across the board? If it's just one state, obviously it'll be 100,000 pounds. If it's 5 states, how are we going to divvy that accounting up? And that's something that the board will have to discuss at a future date. As far as how it will apply to the federal rules, I think that there might be an opportunity for some modifications to the federal rules that under Addendum 30 would allow for the federal rules to be more liberal, and the states under the umbrella of a more liberal federal regulations would then be able to work through Addendum 30 to establishing their limits. Now, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, even North Carolina, I believe, we have just gone forward each year with what those federal rules have been. So what I'm saying here is that there might be an opportunity at the December meeting when we're setting specifications to set federal rules from May 1, let's say, through December 31st with no closure. And then that opens the door for states having the flexibility under Addendum 30 to make modifications within their region or at the state level to fall within and take and absorb the 100,000 pounds in some ratio if you would choose to participate. Now that's how I'm seeing it happen, but I could be way off, but that's, in discussions I've had with Garfo, that's where we might be. John?
I just don't want to be in one of these damned if you do, damned if you don't situations where if we don't participate and the rules change in federal waters, we're going to get catch heck from our fishermen that want to know why we didn't open in February and take advantage of that, or why we're now have a shorter season and we didn't even fish in February. So it's kind of a tough situation right now. It's hard to, without knowing exactly what will happen at this point.
Yeah, John, I think because we haven't finalized Addendum 30, there's questions still. The scenario you're suggesting would be one for which if we were to follow through as a board in establishing a Delmarva region, and let's just say Virginia participates, but the board also decides that all of the states within a region need to have the same regulations, and that's something that the board decides on. Well, then we won't be able to do that if Virginia participates and Delaware and Maryland don't, because we're going to need the same regulations, and Virginia will need to be accountable for part of this. So the later decisions that we're going to make this more complicated, but it's all tied together, and that's the best I can do to offer an answer for you, John. Chris Batsavage.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the explanation as far as how that will work out with states choosing to participate versus not if this motion passes. Quickly, we support this motion, and besides the reasons given already, and despite the fact we have a pretty small fishery, recreational fishery north of Hatteras, we're the only state in this board that has Wave 1 MRIP sampling and have had it since 2004. So we've been closed since 2013, despite our ability to sample that wave and the money we spend on that on those efforts. But with that, if this motion passes, we have the ability to collect biological information through the dockside intercepts, and likely could collect carcasses through our statewide carcass collection program.
Thanks, Chris. Nicola Meserve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think when Brandon was referencing the motion, he said that 100,000 pounds would be allocated to February, but I just want to be clear that it's not really an allocation in the sense that the fishery wouldn't close when what limited information is available would indicate 100,000 pounds has been landed, nor would the participating states be accountable for catch above that level later on in the season. And I ask that question because I think we have every reason to believe that harvest is going to be greater than the projected 100,000 pounds. That was the middle of the road estimate based on 2013. Effort is most likely going to be greater as other fisheries like fluke have been constrained. Availability of sea bass has increased. The 2015 year class will begin recruiting to the fishery next year. So I fear that those participating states are going to have a lot more benefit than they're being held accountable for, and those states that don't participate will see none of that. And that's not because we don't want to participate and have this option, but it doesn't do anything for us based on our geographic location. I'm also concerned about the interplay of this option with Addendum 30. I believe it jeopardizes the good work, the good progress that we're making on trying to bring about more uniform regulations along the coast to address the equity issue. And I also have questions about how our constituents are going to respond to a February 2018 fishery that is open to everyone, followed by a February 2019 LOA fishery that is only open to certain people as of yet to be determined. So I think we're getting ahead of ourselves trying to do this year with too many questions unanswered about how much harvest is going to result. We will never know, and how it's going to, and jeopardizing the Addendum 30 initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Doug Grout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like someone to help me out here, and I've heard in determining how we're going to actually get an estimate of what is actually harvested. If we what is actually harvested here. I've heard Adam say that there will be a logbook in New Jersey, there is a logbook, and they'll have observers out there to help validate. Does that requirement apply to all for-hire boats up and down the Mid-Atlantic area that may want to participate in this fishery? And then how would the private boats, however few they may be, how does their catch get accounted for outside of North Carolina, which has a wave 1 intercepts, and how would that be accounted so that we have data on the harvest that would go into the stock assessment? Can anybody enlighten me on that as to where we get the information on that?
So, Doug, it's my understanding, the way that Garfo is interpreting this motion, that the 100,000 pounds will be what states will be held to regardless of what estimate comes from data collection as far as VTR data. That's the only source of information other than the North Carolina Wave 1 work that will go towards estimating what was caught. Brandon spoke to the fact that that's VT, it's voluntary VTR data, but that's all we'll have. Now, to the points made about, well, what if the harvest is more than 100,000 pounds, and we learn that a year later when we bring all the information that we have together and determine that 200,000 pounds were caught. Well, it's my understanding that the way that the Garfo is looking at this is that the states will not have to pay any additional accountable measures back for anything over 100 is 100, and that's what it's going to be. 100,000 will be 100,000. Regarding private angler, there won't be private angler data collected. While there might not be very many private anglers participating, there's possible that there could be some. These are some of the concerns. These are some of the problems that we've discussed many times about a system that has the accountability that a Wave 1 opening has. And I'll look to Brandon or Caitlin or Kirby to add anything, but I think that's where we stand on this at this point as far as information and what we know. Doug?
So we have volunteer VTR data that's going to be used for this? Is that what I just heard? That they don't have to report it? I know we've got mandatory coming in probably later in the year, but...
Yeah, I may have misspoke. Brandon?
I mean, it's mandatory VTR. It's self-reported, though. There's no validation to what's being reported, but it's mandatory that that information be provided.
That's what I meant.
Federally permitted for-hire vessels.
So the for-hire vessels will be covered at least with, there will be some numbers that they will provide, and at least in New Jersey, there'll be some kind of validation of that, according to what I thought I heard Adam say. But there won't be any MRIP data for PR, for private rentals, outside of North Carolina in there. So we'll have a gap in that information. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think your understanding is correct, and thanks for correcting me. I did misspeak. I'm not, and towards New Jersey's suggestion for, I don't know if it's necessarily a validation, but more of a ground truthing of what's coming in regarding the sampling that they're would be conducting. So, all right, we have a few more people on the list. I am going to limit discussion to some degree. We're over our allotted time on this agenda item, and we still have FMP compliance to deal with. This has been a conversation we've had many times over the year, so I don't think we need to debate it very much longer. I'm going to go to Emerson, and then David Borden, and I may take one or two more comments, and then we'll call the question. Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had several issues, but I'll limit it to two issues. because of time. So
I'm sorry, Emerson.
that's quite all right, because one of my comments is kind of directed at something that you said, so I wanted you to finish your conversation with Tony. That's okay. So you had mentioned how we're going to have to get together and decide how that 100,000 pounds is going to be partitioned among whatever states might be interested in participating in this. I'm just wondering when that might occur. I mean, February isn't very far away. So that was one issue I wanted to raise. And the other is, I've heard what New Jersey has planned for them to participate. I've heard that North Carolina already has MRIP sampling in that state during Wave 1. I'm just wondering if there's any other states around the table who are interested in participating in this, who might be able to provide some information in terms of how they're going to quantify the harvest.
Okay, so Emerson, to your first question, to what I stated earlier, I'm not sure when we'll have that conversation. It'll need to be had before states set forth their recreational measures for next year. And that will come as a result of decisions made through Addendum 30. So at some point before a state implements new rules, the board will have to discuss that. There are 2 board meetings. One is in February and one will be in December. So that's all I can offer as far as with the timing, that's when it will need to happen. First, and I'll speak for Maryland, we will not be able to sample our port in Ocean City during that wave. We won't be able to generate any. If we were to participate, we wouldn't be able to sample. Okay, Rob, I'm going to come back to you. I have David Borden, then Rob O'Reilly, and David Bush. David Borden.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of the, excuse me, a lot of the points have already been made, but I'm concerned about the lack of specificity on some of the elements here, and I won't, in the interest of time, I won't go into that because some of the other people have talked about it. I'm also concerned about having a volunteer data collection program without making sure that if we're going to have that type of system that is standardized across all of the participating states, I think that's going to be kind of critical. I'm also concerned, my final point, I'm also concerned about the overage, and your statement in particular that if there's an overage beyond 100,000, then it's not going, the way I understood your statement, it's not going to apply to the participants, which means it's eventually that everyone in this room is going to be held accountable for it. So I'm opposed to the motion.
Thank you, David. Rob O'Reilly.
Thanks, Chairman. So I wanted to address Emerson's request there, and as I said earlier, Virginia is prepared to do sampling and has started the sort of an approach to recreational reporting, which is mandatory. Just out of the gate, has a year under the belt so far. Compliance is about almost 60% with cobia. That's why we started all this specifically, although we have striped bass and blue line tilefish. So the pool of effort is going to be rather small. There's a very limited number of headboats in Virginia. There are a few private anglers that we've heard of that would be availing themselves of this opportunity. I realize we get dug in to our perceptions, but the past is always present, and I certainly remember sitting with Tony Kearns in 2010 when we had a blowout of the RHL by Wave 4, and Tony and I were able to figure out a path forward, and that path forward included Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, which it was during the time of conservation equivalency, foregoing any liberalization, and some of that liberalization was quite remarkable, foregoing that liberalization so that the states north of us did not have to suffer the penalty. So that's 2010, that's not 1998. That's 2010, 7 years ago. So I'm wondering about some of the comments as to are they really concerns, or are they something that maybe shouldn't be concerns? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. David Bush.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Generally in support of this, I know that we did discuss the data collection concerns that we had. And now, if I understand this correctly, all this is simply the directive to open up this fishery. Once this goes through, we'll have to actually spell out how to execute that fishery. And if that's correct, would there not be the possibility of states wishing to participate some sort of data collection of some sort, whether it be mail-in, whether it be something? Would that be an option at that point?
David, I think if a state can offer more, there wouldn't be anything stopping them. Like you said, if this is supported, essentially the Commission and the Council will be recommending to National Marine Fisheries Service to open federal waters to black sea bass fishing in February. What the states do from there will be on them. There will be no requirement to put forth a data collection effort on the states, even if they do participate. It's been suggested that some states will do that. They have the means and the interest to do that. Others will or will not. Does that suffice to answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I'm going to take one last comment. I'm going to come back to you, Adam. I know you had your hand up. After that, we're going to caucus for a minute and we'll call the question. Thank you. Adam?
So again, thank you very much. I think this is all very good discussion. Frankly, I haven't heard any point raised that hasn't been discussed with people that I've spoken about with this issue. Again, it's not going to be a sense of no accounting. We'll have the VTR data, and then that VTR data will use past relationships between the for-hire sector and the non-for-hire sector to go ahead and establish an estimate of the overall recreational catch for that period. So it's not going to be just a free pass for the non-for-hire sector. It is being accounted for. I have to go back to the fact that we've got the services support on this, and this motion incorporates a lot of their concerns. That is something that provides a level of assurance that they are confident that we can move this forward through the regulatory process. Otherwise, they would be wasting their time putting together a proposed rule that they didn't think they could ultimately promulgate. And let me finally close with the idea of this winter fishery and the potential for it to be large. We deal with snowstorms and frozen slips and bait dealers that are closed, haul-out provisions in insurance policies, marina operators that go to Florida for the winter. You go after the first of the year and participation just goes to zero. Those vessels that do, or fishermen that do still want to participate, they want to get on a headboat. So for those states that have talked to your own for-hire operators and maybe they're not going to participate themselves, you may have a lot of fishermen in your own state that you haven't heard from that would really love the opportunity to go ahead, jump in the truck on a cold winter morning, get in a heated bunk, take advantage of a heated handrail, and take some fish home out of a biomass that's 230% of its target. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Let's go ahead and caucus for a minute. We'll come back, read the motion, and vote. Thank you. And apologize to the public. This is not a new issue. We've heard much public comment on this issue so far, so we're going to skip that and go right to the vote. I'm just waiting on staff. I believe we've been asked to do a roll call vote, so as soon as we're set, I'm going to ask Kirby to call the vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As noted, this is a roll call vote. We're going to go south to north, starting with North Carolina.
Yes.
Commonwealth of Virginia.
Yes.
Potomac River Fisheries is not present. Maryland.
Yes.
Delaware.
No.
New Jersey.
Yes.
New York.
Abstain.
Connecticut.
No.
Rhode Island.
No.
Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
No.
New Hampshire.
Abstain.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Abstain.
National Marine Fisheries Service.
Yes.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
It's not 5 to 4 to 3.
Okay, our count here is 5 in favor, 4 no votes, 3 abstentions. Motion carries. So that recommendation will be made on behalf of the Council and the Commission to National Marine Fisheries Service. We're going to move on to our last agenda item. Given the interest of time, I've decided that we are just going to go through the Scup compliance and FMP report. So we'll deal with summer flounder and black sea bass at a later time because of the issue with compliance in the Scup fishery. I'll turn to Kirby for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've adjusted our PowerPoint. We're just going to focus on Scup today as noted. So regarding compliance and de minimis requests, the plan review team notes that Massachusetts measures are not consistent with those in the FMP, specifically with regard to the minimum mesh requirements and the threshold triggers regarding the bycatch fishery, or the bycatch provision, excuse me, in the state squid fishery. Initially, the plan review team also noted that Rhode Island's measures were not consistent with those in the FMP regarding the minimum mesh and escape vent size requirements. Rhode Island staff has followed up and actually provided us with updated information. They have noted that their information in their compliance report was incorrect, and therefore, with the updated information, they are consistent with the plan. We have one request for de minimis from the state of Delaware. And then the last point, just as there was an extensive PRT review, the state compliance report should explicitly list all required regulations and whether they are in compliance with the FMP. We had some challenges with that this year, and that pots and traps should be separated from other types of gear in the commercial harvest by gear table. With that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Any questions for Kirby? That was quick. I didn't even hear him speak yet. Any questions for Kirby? Kirby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, as noted, there was a compliance inconsistency with regards to Massachusetts regulations. They've provided a memo that was included in supplemental materials. If you have specific questions about that, Dr. Pierce is available to answer them now, and they've also provided us with a motion they would like to make regarding that.
David Pierce.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This was a bit of a surprise to me. Staff identified the fact that we weren't in compliance. And as a consequence, there's a need for us to get into compliance. So I have a motion to make, Mr. Chairman, that gets to that particular issue, because we have every intention of changing our rule to comply now that we found out that there was a problem. So I would move to postpone board action on Massachusetts noncompliance with the Scup incidental trip limits for bottom trawl vessels not meeting the minimum mesh size until the winter ASMFC meeting. And again, if I get a second, then that's just to make sure that we have some time to set things right.
Thank you, David. So we have a motion. Do we have a second for the motion? Senator Boyle seconds the motion. Discussion on the motion? David Borden.
Yeah, I'm supportive of the request, but do we actually need a motion if we just postpone approving the report until the winter meeting? It would give Massachusetts adequate time to actually put together the proposal. Not sure you heard it.
I'm sorry, David, go ahead.
Well, what I said was if we just postpone taking action on the report until the winter meeting, then Massachusetts would have adequate time to put together a conservation equivalency proposal. So I kind of see this as being unnecessary. I'd prefer to just postpone approving the report, compliance report.
We can do that. David, if you want to make if you want to modify your motion to just move to postpone approval of the FMP and compliance for Scup to the winter meeting, we can just take up the whole thing at the winter meeting.
If the seconder doesn't disagree, then I would prefer to go in that direction. As I said, it'll be fixed by the time we get to the winter meeting.
Senator Boyle, you okay with perfecting that motion? All right, so let's get it up on the screen, and then I'll call the question. Give me 1 second. Okay. The motion is move to postpone board approval of the Scup FMP review and state compliance reports until the winter ASMFC meeting. All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. It's 10 in favor. Any opposition? Any null votes? Any abstentions? 1 abstention. Motion carries. Okay, because we didn't receive the presentation on summer flounder and black sea bass, if it's okay with this board, we will send out, we will take up that via an email between now and a future date, a later date. We'll do an email vote. That concludes our business. Is there any other business to come before the board? Okay, I just wanted to thank everybody for their hard work. So just to note, this is my last board meeting as your chair. We have met probably about 15 to 16 times over the last 2 years. So tonight is going to go on the list that includes my wife's, marrying my wife and having my 2 children. This is now the next thing that makes me about as happy as can be. And I look to my left, and I'm going to be passing the baton to Bob, who's going to take you under his wing, and I'm sure he's thrilled about that right now. So thank you all very much. We stand adjourned.